Okay, so we're going to try this. I think this will be the first ever mock interview given on an iPhone. Possibly not, but anyway. Um, so basically this is going to be me interviewing myself, but the majority of the questions actually came from people on Facebook who wanted to know certain things about the writing process, the novel, my sexual proclivities, and many other things. Um, so anyway, um, now we'll actually start off with a question that I came up with. I thought people might ask or wonder about, and to sort of give a background to this question. I'm 32 years old and just finally got around to publishing my first novel. So the question is, why did it take so long to A, write a novel, and B, publish anything? And the answer to that question is that I didn't feel like I had enough life experience years and years ago. I sort of had to get out into the world, travel around South Korea, China, get married, have a daughter, and live life before I could really infuse that into the stories that I was writing. I already had a good sense of my voice and of uh, storytelling from an intellectual point of view, but I needed to put that emotional content into it as well. All right, so I'm going to try to make all of these short so that this isn't a huge long video. Um, the first question is from William Gant, and these are all from Facebook. What was the most difficult part of character development? The most difficult part of character development was sort of getting out of the way and allowing the characters to tell the story themselves and to be themselves rather than creating. Of course, you have to start off with sort of these cookie cutter characters, but then along the way, they have to get outside of those rigid boundaries and sort of, just like humans, interact with their environment in their own way, and that actually changes the story in many different ways. All right. And that kind of leads into the question from Peter Adam Pittman. Did you create the novel, or was it more of a spontaneous manifestation of something? What was your heart intent on writing? I did sort of create it. Again, I sort of let the characters sort of eventually took the story off in their own direction. But a lot of it actually came from four different parts I originally had. Um, the original story actually came to me when I was probably 19 or 20, somewhere around there, and it was just this idea of a city, and of course I leave that as sort of a generic the city in the story, so that sort of takes on a dreamlike quality. The characters don't have last names and what have you. And there's no real basis in reality. But uh, it's sort of the story of this city falling into the ocean. As we've heard, a city will eventually, and I used to live there and go through the earthquakes and all of that. But it's the idea that the city's falling into the ocean, and these people who are suicidal are enjoying their life. You know, they're having this great, big, grand, wonderful party and adventure. So that was really the original impetus for the story, and where that came from, who knows? You know, where do any of these ideas come from? And I've got thousands that are going to get put in all the novels that I do. The name, the Cinderella of Chimes, actually came from I was sitting in this years later when I was in college, and sitting around and kind of actually trying to flesh out the story a little bit. Finally, it had been in my head for a couple of years. I was finally trying to work on it as a short story, I guess. And I was sitting in a history of jazz class, and the professor was going over these old beatnik terms. And of course, I was probably half listening, even though that was probably the most interesting class I took. I loved that class. I was probably half listening and half doodling and half working on the story. And all of a sudden, it kind of hit me, the Cinderella of Chimes, which means midnight. And I just thought, wow. And it just sort of fleshed with the story and combined, and yeah, that's perfect. And so it actually stuck with it for, another, almost 10 years or so before I finally actually started really working on it. In the story, there's a short story inserted into the story that I wrote around the time that I named it The Cinderella of Chimes. So I had this short story that I never published or did anything with for about 10 years. And except every now and again I would read it to friends out aloud. And I put it in there not just to fill space, but because it sort of seemed to fit. I wrote that story, The Mark and the Executioner, originally because a friend of mine was going off this was during the Bush administration, and Bush Jr., a W, and was going off. This was when they had just sort of reinserted themselves into Iraq, and he was going off. And, it touched me deeply that possibly my best friend was going off into harm's way. And so it was very emotionally disheartening, and I had to focus all of that into the story. And so I drew that out, that short story, not only because it's extremely relevant for today still, but also it just sort of became the linchpin that I hung everything else in the novel on. Somehow it just sort of became the central impetus for the story. Don't ask me how, it just happened. Okay? Um, and that's sort of the way that it worked, and I'll talk a little bit about that in... No, I think that actually is the question that I was supposed to ask. Um, yeah, and so, I tend to put these things in all of my stories, drawn from like dream journals and everything. Real life experiences, what have you. I kind of sprinkle them throughout all the stories that I write, and you'll never be able to sort of filter them out, but they're there. So yeah, what was I talking about? Anyway, there's a fourth part, the jungle sequence that Jack goes through, his memory of his time in the jungle. That's actually based on the very first short story that I ever wrote when I was about 12 years old. And the funny thing was, I actually found it about a year ago and read through it, and it's actually not that bad. It's kind of funny. I'll come back to all of my old work and I'll go, oh man, this is going to be terrible. And I start reading through it, and I was like, wow, that's really good, especially for a 12-year-old. All right. And Peter also has another question. What was your heart intent on writing? My heart was intent on writing a story that talked more about beginnings rather than endings, and sort of asking people and poking people and making them think about what's important in their life. What's your reason for waking up in the morning? One of my philosophy teachers in college used to say that everyone has a philosophy. Even the baker has to wake up in the morning and have some reason for getting up and making bread. And you can take that as bread as money and bread as what we eat. But yeah, so it's sort of asking people to find out what's important in their lives and what they believe in. And I hear too many people just, you ask them how they're doing, and they go, oh, well, and sort of this long drawn out, and then they sort of give you all these things. no matter what's going on in your life, those are trials and tribulations. That's part of the adventure. That's part of the script, you know. If things were all smooth sailing, then what would be the point of it? You know, it would be a very boring story. So, hopefully that answers that. This next one comes from Stephen Fox of the band God's Forgotten, and it asks, who is your most influential author? Everyone that I've ever read, but the three that tend to influence my stories more than anybody else are Harlan Ellison, Neil Gaiman, and Douglas Adams. Douglas Adams probably because of the sort of slapstick way that he'll tell a story, even when he's being emotional. You know, he has that sort of breaking of the third wall and trying to get directly to the reader. And then the rest probably Harlan Ellison, Neil Gaiman for sort of the darker elements of the storytelling, as well as revealing psychological aspects, also inventive story ideas, I suppose. The author, which you will find on Amazon if you do a search, Samuel Morningstar, asks, what parts of the story are based upon real life experiences? Pretty much everything comes either from bits of my philosophy or things that I'm actually against. I mean, if you put everything that you believe into a story and you don't have any antagonistic elements, then again, a very boring story. But yeah, and then of course there are parts from my dream journals and things I sprinkle throughout, just interesting little things that have popped up. And then a lot of times, a lot of the dialogue and sort of every now and again my characters will go on these tangents. And I always try to fit it in within the story, but a lot of those tangents are actual conversations that I sometimes find myself engaged in. So that's an interesting little side note. See if you can pick that out. But yeah. Okay, and then we get to two not so serious questions. Sarah Lawless, the goddaughter to my, the godmother to my daughter, asks, tell us about your one and only tattoo, when, where, and why it was given to you. I don't actually have a tattoo, but what she's referring to was I used to make sort of off-color jokes when I was in Korea. She was a fellow teacher there, sort of at her expense, and she has a feisty personality and would often pick up a pen and would stab me. So I probably still have scars, and she's probably referring to some of the ink getting under my skin and giving me tattoos. So it could be, you know. Anyway, you can always go and check. Sandy Fortune of BOC Pizza in Seoul, South Korea, asked a couple of questions that were too vulgar and graphic to mention. So I'm going to skip him, which wouldn't be the first time. And finally, Ryan Naranha, a good friend and fellow writer, asks a few questions. Number one, what was the most challenging part about writing the book? Finding the time to write it. I'm an average person. It took me less than a year to write the book, which, or to get it where I want it to be, not just to write it. But, and which in grand terms is probably not that long. But you'll have to remember that I'm used to doing things sort of quickly and precisely, and obviously you can tell from this interview. But I just didn't have any time, so I was spending every free moment that I had during the day working on the novel until it was finally done. And So yeah, finding the time, that was the most challenging part, and hopefully that's going to get a little bit better. Uh, which also goes into his next question, could you lend me a fiver? Yes. As soon as this book starts selling massive amounts of qualities, I will be of copies. Sorry, I will be more than happy to lend you a fiver. And his last question, which is kind of the most interesting, which is why I saved it for last. People sometimes access deep, dark parts of themselves through their own art. What did you find out about yourself as you worked through the novel? It wasn't so much that I found out. There are a lot of deep, deep, dark things that bubbled up in the novel, obviously. Um, but I wasn't exactly surprised that they were there. I've worked with the shadow part of my personality quite a bit. And so, not so much that they're normal conscious parts of my personality. I'm normally a pretty fun guy and easy to get along with, but the fact that that you know we all have these things that we go, oh my God, where did that come from? You know, but the fact that I was not that they were there, but the fact that I was able to sort of release that consciousness about the process and just let them roll out. I could forget that. Oh, my friends, my family are going to read this. I'd better not put that in there. But the fact that I could just sort of give up on that idea and just let it flow out, so that the story could be more authentic in its own story, in its own right, you know. And yeah, so that was kind of what I was surprised to find, the fact that I could actually get out of my own way, basically, and not censor myself. Okay, so this will be the first part of the interview. If there are any other questions, you can always send them to me via Facebook or Twitter or wherever that you can find me, and I will be more than happy to answer them in another interview. And I hope this wasn't such low quality that it turned out to be bad. I'm doing this in my easy chair, by the way, just so that I can be more comfortable and hopefully answer the questions a little more lucidly rather than have to be rigid and, oh God, I don't know. All right, so this was the first successful interview. I'm going to end it now. Thank you. Or I'm going to try as soon as I can find the button on the other side of the phone. Okay, hold on.